Welcome, everyone. I'm Dr. Mary Bryson, Director of UBC's Public Humanities Hub. I'm delighted to welcome you to this exciting event. What a great way to enjoy a snowy day, get a reprieve from shoveling. I would like to acknowledge that our event today takes place on the unceded traditional and ancestral territory of the Musqueam, dispossessed lands. Wherever you're located on Zoom, likely there's an important connection between those lands and our work here today. Let's keep this top of mind in our work together. This event is a collaborative production between the Faculty of Arts, the Public Humanities Hub, and the Institute for Gender, Race, Sexuality, and Social Justice. Special thanks to the Hub staff who work tirelessly to make events happen. The Eurocentric humanities and conceptions of the human are inextricably bound up in and produced by racial logics of ubiquitous whiteness, an unbearable straightness of being gendered, conditions for a belligerently anti-Black world, and more. The Public Humanities Hub Noted Scholar Lecture Series is dedicated to showcasing academic engagement that seeks to rethink, collaboratively curate, vociferously champion imaginative styles of world-making, agitate to secure and redistribute access to disorderings of forms of being, knowledge, and the conditions of belonging, and indeed, and importantly, of survival itself, amongst a very broad set of publics, including most particularly communities historically and persistently marginalized. Please join us February the 7th at noon for a Public Humanities Hub Noted Scholars Lecture by Dr. Ronaldo Walcott, Professor and Granger Chair in Africana and American Studies, University of Buffalo, in dialogue with Dr. Peter Hudson, entitled Between Reparations and Freedoms. Today's lecture brings us to a consideration of the significance of autobiography and ekphrasis, sustained, passionate, and dramatic description in the politics and aesthetics of minoritization, resistance, and resilience. Memoir, and maybe most especially anti-memoir like Nimrods, plays an incredibly important role in contributing unruly narratives to the archives of unbelonging. I'm really excited about today's event. Dr. Chris Patterson, patrilineal name for the author of Nimrods, Kawika Guillermo, is associate professor in the GRSJ Institute and is the author of Transitive Cultures and Open World Empire, Race, Erotics, and the Global Rise of Video Games. Kawika Guillermo, in addition to Nimrods, is the author of Stamped, which won the Asian American Studies Book Award for Best Novel, as well as the queer speculative fiction novel, All Flowers Bloom. In this dialogue today, we're also delighted to welcome Dr. Mila Zuo, Associate Professor in the Department of Theater and Film. Her book, Vulgar Beauty, Acting Chinese in the Global Sensorium, is published by Duke University Press. In addition to her scholarly work, Dr. Zuo writes, directs, and produces award-winning films, visual essays, documentaries, and music videos. Dr. Patterson, Kawika Guillermo, over to you.
Hello, everyone can hear me okay, I guess. Thank you, Mary. Thanks to everyone at the Public Humanities Hub for having me here and doing a lot of the organizing work and publicity. To Mary, to Heather, to Sydney, to Ying, thank you very much. And also to those in my department, GRSJ, Elena, Robin, and to Nora, our chair, for doing this joint venture. And so I think it's, I'm looking forward to the other talks that the Public Humanities Hub is hosting, and I'm really grateful to be part of one of the first of this term. I'm also really happy to be in conversation here with Mila Zuo, who has done such amazing work thinking about Asian American, Chinese American subjectivity and film and fetish. And so I think there's a lot that we can talk about that's in conversation with Nimrod, as well as work on parenthood, on motherhood. And so I'm really excited for that conversation to see what emerges. I'm coming to you now from the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples. And it is a snow day, so my son might be walking around in the background, might come to me very excited about a video he found or something. And so we'll just deal with that if that happens. But thank you again for being here. I do want to begin with a reading from Nimrods, and I will try and do my best to share this as a virtual background. And anyone will let me know if something goes wrong, I assume. Okay. So I will begin first by reading the dedication to the book, which is dedicated to my late wife, partner and soulmate, Yideng Trung, who most of my career and writing would not be possible without. And so I just wanted to read that dedication. In loving memory of Yideng Trung, 1980 to 2022. You were my spirit, my ocean, my brick of a fist. Once more, let us stroll another shore. Pray to the seas, please. And I wanted to read a part of Nimrod's that I haven't read to an audience before. I always like to change it up a bit just to keep myself on my toes, I guess. And because I knew I would be in conversation with Mila, I wanted to choose a bit more that was about Vancouver and about parenthood, as opposed to myself being a parent, more about my own father. And so I'll read that part. And all of the poems in the book don't really have titles to them, but they come in a kind of page poem form, meaning that they are meant to relate to each other, to talk to each other, so that no poem seems to like really be authentically in a voice, I guess, of me, that they're all kind of parts of myself, people I talk to, that they're collective in that way, and they speak to each other and mirror each other. So I'm hoping that through the reading that might come across. But the pagination is also important. So reading them from one page to another, I can't really reproduce that here very well. So I'll try and just do that through my voice. Okay, but this is from chapter 3 or line 3. Oh my God, I'm turning white like my dad. When my family moves from Hong Kong to Vancouver in 2018, I'm the American yokel, the arrogant, overpublished chauvinist who stands tall while the smoke around him clears. The next year, I'm counting numbers with my son when an image on Facebook pricks my sight. The Prime Minister of Canada, Justin Trudeau, in a full body paint Aladdin costume, his arms over angular white women as if pretending to abduct them. The headline says he wore brown face at a 2001 gala when he was a teacher at the West Point Grey Academy in Vancouver. I look up the school. It's 2 miles from our apartment. Over the next week, I learn a lot about my colleagues in my new city. They are disappointed but not angry. They are worried about how this will all go down in the news, but nobody asked me, as the father in a brown family, how this is going down for me. Few people think that one incident in brownface, which escalates to 2 more in blackface, is a reason to withhold a vote. Few people think that October 2001, 1 month after 9/11, when violence against Muslims and anyone Muslim-looking had skyrocketed 1,700% and the US was indiscriminately bombing Afghanistan to hell, was a bad time to walk the streets of a multicultural city in a costume, I can't even read that, in a costume that said, "Your face is my punchline." Quick to quote the unprimed minister, their moment in the movement to join the black-faced parades. Too brown to frown, wait till they get you in an Arabian gown. The reluctant fly in the fumed ointment that treats the brown residues of a diaper rash. This where my son will live with these people, these people, these people, who insist to hug you, so their faces never need look you in the eyes. We, planet of galaxy diversitas, some larger than others, some darker than others, some in strange ellipticals, some with icy crowns, some nearer to the void, some so small and far away, some no longer count as planets. We, each our own gravitas, Romanized, mythological, circling, solar, depth where creation pulls. All the Toms in New Age gowns, my father, Howley, a-hole, the elliptical that draws our gravity. But can a planet please stop circling the sun? I once saw myself in Aladdin, even though he was a different kind of brown and his face was modeled off Tom Cruise. Quick, cunning, nippleless chest. Aladdin taught me that when they say Asian people complimentarily, they never mean me. And when they say white people disparagingly, they do mean me. And when they say us, they mean me only insofar as I pass their tests. And when they say them, that is one of their tests. And this, my dear Phil and me, they will still give their children the surnames of their fathers, and their brown-faced photographs are still just one step away from exposure. From where, my son will ask, does our brownness come? And I will declare, a-hole. A colleague's family visit. While playing with our son, their 4-year-old daughter says casually, brown is disgusting. Not brown like chocolate, but brown like skin. Disgusting. The parents' faces are red with embarrassment. My wife and I try to laugh it off. We ask as if to puncture the wound again. Our baby is brown. Do you think he is disgusting? We do not know it, but we are testing them. The parents as well as the child. The girl just keeps gazing at our son. But we are battle ready with recoded verge, for it makes no difference whatever utterance she makes. 10 things to tell my father. 1. You voted for Trump twice and trampled anyone on social media who disagreed. And you are white. 2. You married a Filipina you never bothered to learn was Ilocana. And you are white. 3. You suffered from alcoholism, depression, suicidal ideation. And you are white. 4. You worked far harder, for far longer, for far less pay than I ever will. And you are white. 5. A Korean woman once worshipped you, believing you were God. She told me this when you got up to use the John. And you are white. Oh, Asian men, we cucks of America, we beta bucks of buxom lovers, we changs to their chads. We, curry celibate, take our femoids, we'll be snorting blue pill powder beside other wallflower ornamentation. Lay down, rot, get your easy nut of rice pill swallowers. Our looks match, so why not let me roast, be the mog upon the rope. We, wordsmiths, with imagery entice and straddle dazzle, the quatrain. 4 things only mixed brown kids know. 1. As a child, everyone says we're beautiful because no one knows our kind of ugly. 2. As a teenager, no one acknowledges we exist, so we throw donuts at passing cars to see what racial epithet people will scream at us. 3. I see it now. You're actually white, Mexican, black, indigenous. 4. No lanes, just the intersection of down and brown. I've told many people casually that I hate my last name, Patterson. 1. I chose to write fiction under a different name, my mother's name. 2. My wife did not take my father's name, and neither did my son. 3. My sister changed her last name back to my mother's. 4. My brother moved an ocean away and never returned. When a father divorces, 1. Wife gone, kids gone. 2. No one around to hurt. 3. No one who needs him. 4. To stay sober. 6. You were a janitor, a gas station attendant, a caretaker for the mentally disabled, a middle school teacher, an Amazon contract worker, and you are white. 7. I was a janitor once, a warehouse worker, a middle school teacher. 8. I nearly had your life. I would not have survived. 9. Perhaps I did not. 10. Perhaps you did not. Mixed being white. Mongrel, what's up? Halfie playing around like Hapa and Mahu stole it from Kanaka Maoli, but Halfu's still not getting it. My nowhere is home, and anyway, shit. Anyone in this city ever seen some real trash before? The kind that streaks across paper, and it could be a turd or leftover chocolate. What else would you call dirt like us? The father who had no dreams, but they were stolen anyway. The mother who takes what she wants, but she doesn't really want it anyway. The son who didn't ask his family's permission to write this book, but did it anyway. Neither we, they, nor fungus likes to be contained, nor to think of themselves as containable. Like the father who claimed he was the first person to call someone a Nimrod, and why not? It's a whole brown world. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Chris, for that beautiful reading. If I can jump in here. First, I'd like to begin by thanking Chris for inviting me to be his interlocutor today. And I'm also speaking on the unceded traditional and ancestral lands of the Musqueam people. It's such a delight to be in conversation with you, Chris. You're so talented and super intimidatingly prolific. But I'm also proud to call you my friend. But even though we're friends, I learned so much about you from this astounding work. I love that you are wrestling with masculinity and whiteness in front of us. And since you and I are both American citizens, I really relate to the kinds of ways you talk about unbelonging in the US, and also just the beautiful shit talking about the US that you do so well. It's impossible to encapsulate all that this book does, but the words that immediately came to my mind were bruising, hilarious, irreverent, heartbreaking. First, I wanted to start by asking you to situate this book for us in terms of your trajectory as a writer and thinker. So how does this follow from books that you've written on video games, Southeast Asian migrant literature, a novel about travel, traveling around in Asia, a queer speculative novel? What prompted this book at this particular time in your life?
Thank you for that. And yeah, I'm excited to answer these questions. This was a question that I think I proposed to Mila, and then I didn't think about it at all for some reason. So now I'm thinking about it. I feel like it follows a lot of the work that I've done in not necessarily in a quite linear sense, because a lot of when I first came to writing, it was always very speculative and very collaborative, whether it was with my twin brother when we were making up stories when we were like 6 and 7, and writing comics together, to like chat room role playing, which was one of the main ways I used to write as a young teenager and as a teenager. So it was always with others and inhabiting different kinds of bodies, I guess, like different roles, role playing in those rooms. And so I never really thought of myself as an interesting person to write about. But I did write I always wrote a lot of poetry, and poetry is kind of like by default a bit more nonfiction, a bit more memoirish. I just never thought I was a good poet at all. I just liked doing it, and I liked sharing it at open mics and with other people and like at parties. Like, or if sometimes I would like need gasoline or need a place to stay. So I'd go to open mic night and be like, hey, I'll write you a poem if you let me sleep at your place, on your couch or something. Back when I was a bit less bougie than I am now, I guess. So I always wrote poetry, and it was always kind of about me, but I never wanted to really publish it or share it, and I just thought it was awful. Like, it was just a fun thing. And then when my son was born in 2017, and when my wife Eden got pregnant at that time, I never expected to be a father. I never wanted to be, really. I never envisioned that for myself. And even my mother would say, I never have kids. Shows you what she thought of us. But yeah, so advice I got from everyone was never have kids. And I just thought, I'm never going to have a kid. So I never had to really think through what it would actually be like to have that responsibility. And the idea of passing on a lot of the patriarchal traits that my father had and then gave to me, better or worse, or that I inherited, and a lot of the religious ideas that I had inherited and tried to cast off, that suddenly I had this power over this whole other person. And at the time, I was also living in Hong Kong and had gotten involved in the Occupy movements, either as an educator or as going to the protests and things like that, and just seeing how powerful poetry was in that context, right? And we're seeing it now in like Gaza, for example, the ways that poetry is just circulating, right, so much. And in context of protest, and when the people who are being colonized are under such disproportionate amounts of power and have no power themselves, poetry is often a place people go. And so I saw that like live constantly in Hong Kong during the Occupy movement, and then afterwards. My students just loved to read and absorb poetry, and it was always instantly very political for them. And I just started to look back on the writings I had done, and I just really wanted to do something that was more involved and directly involved in that way. And once my son was born, all of these words just started coming. And I actually tried to hold them back for a while because I had all these other writing things I wanted to get done. And so it was just kind of getting in the way. And eventually I realized I can't really hold it back. I have to like write it down somewhere. And so I would I would like write in a cafe or somewhere, and I would have to write the words for Nimrods first before I could do anything else, before I could look at emails, just because they had been like building. And often I wasn't sleeping because yeah, parenthood does that to you too. So I would stay up all night and words would just come and I would have to get them out. And a lot of them were written in collaboration with my family. And I think that was also something I wanted to do more, that I regretted not doing enough in my past work, that I saw family as a horrible thing for a lot of time as a writer, that I didn't want to involve them or anyone. And then I think I started to become closer to my family, my Brown side especially, and hearing the stories about that they had shared about survival, not just from like my father, but from the kind of white spaces in Oregon, which they had all fled from, and trying to think about that in my own work, and like, why have I been so interested in writing about all of these speculative fun things and weird things when there's so many stories right here with me. And so a lot of Nimrods was written with them in collaboration with them. Neither me nor they ever really assumed it would get published. We just thought like this is a kind of a fun side project. Maybe it'll go into a genealogy of the family at someday. And eventually I found that people really responded to the poetry and to the words. And I just thought like, yeah, we're gonna have to continue with it. So it is kind of it follows from my past work, but it's also a bit of a rupture, I think, from a lot of the language that I had been trained to see and to value, whereas there was all this other language that was always there, and just letting that flow was how this book came to be.
Thanks, Chris. I love what you just said. It reminds me of what Deleuze and Guattari describe as the minor, of course, like this stammering, stuttering, interrupting language in the majoritarian to create new consciousness. And as someone who doesn't write poetry or really study it, I'm just sort of in awe of the work here. I also think that new consciousness, that sort of that feeling that there's something very new here. It speaks to this kind of mixed race queer phenomenology that I haven't seen in a lot of works that that you're really tackling in a kind of very experimental fashion. So I guess in terms of understanding the kind of mixed race kind of perspective that you give alongside that identity, you discuss fatherhood, holding this position at the university as an academic writer. And one of my favorite lines, by the way, is that you teach students to hate their parents. But can you just say more about your relationship to all these kinds of identities or identity markers, including masculinity and whiteness?
Yeah, I wanted to think quite kind of critically about mixed race, and I didn't see mixed race studies as the best place for that, though I did find a lot of value in that. I think because it's such an unwieldy kind of subjectivity, in that mixed race will always kind of suggest, part whiteness and part something else, whereas then there's the idea that everyone's mixed race and there's no point in even talking about it. And so I think that either way, there's this obscurity and malaise to that subject. And I think that can often then like reiterate this like tragic, mixed race kind of type. So I wanted to like take that and think about it alongside like queerness, like pansexuality, alongside fatherhood, and really just get to like, what does it mean to grow up in a family that's where the mother and father just really do not understand each other on that kind of political, racial, social level, and almost there's like an indifference to that history, or a negligence, a dismissal of that history. And what does it mean when like feelings of like parental love and affection come with a complete ignorance of those politics and those histories? And I think there's the suspicion throughout the book of what I come to call like regimes or languages of care and compassion, and the way that and love and health, and the way that those get utilized constantly by racial capitalist interests, companies, institutions, states, in order to just further violence and pain and hurt. And I think growing up in the church, especially, gave me this lens to like be very suspicious of any of that language, because the language of the church that I grew up in, at least, is constantly couched in this language of, it's good for you to do this. We care about you. God loves you, even if you're dying because of him, or even if, and just wants you to be better, wants you to not be queer because it's bad for you. And I carry that when in any kind of setting where as soon as, and it's not necessarily that that's a good thing, right? That being immediately suspicious of those can sometimes not be great for your own, mental health and ability to accept others. But so anyways, back to the point about mixed race, I wanted to kind of get to what that actually means, like growing up for me with that, and then just share it, right? See if others connect with it, see if that is a thing that other people feel and relate to. And I wanted to also be very critical of a kind of mixed race subjectivity that I've seen a lot on TikTok these days. I don't know what's going on. It's all back, but it's this like idea that we can be whoever we want, that like we're just flowing in and out of identities and all this stuff. And it does take quite a bit of privilege, of course, to be able to take that point of view on fully. I think there's still something there, but it's often a mixed race person who is espousing that point of view. And so I'm also very curious how we can deal with that from our own experiences. Like, what is it about our experiences that allows us to assume that we are somehow like above the fray of identity? And I think a lot of it is like that unbelonging that you were talking about, and not being seen, that it kind of defaults into this position of, well, if they can't see me, then I can be anything I want, right? And back to your other question, I see that a little bit in my own work, right? So trying to think about it critically and from a distance, and how that came to be. What were the conditions, right, that produced that? Is part of what Nimrods is all about. Yeah.
Thanks, Chris. Yeah. I love the kind of aggressiveness of the title, and that echoes through the book, of course. And this is another framing question, but you are self-effacing very literally with your photos and figuratively, and you share like your proximity to like at one moment your proximity to incel culture, and that being a potential possible path that you would go down, right? And so I was wondering if you could just address that aspect of your work, that kind of very self-confrontational thing. And I think that relates to the title, self-hurt, fake punk, anti-memoir. Yeah.
I might ask you to also respond to how you read that, because I'm very curious with your work on Kin, your first short film, thinking about like racial fetish and thinking about how all those kind of proximity to like incel culture and things like that, things that we don't really talk about that much, especially as professors, right? That these things are like thoughts we might have had at some point, right? Or things that we had to confront and find our own ways through. And I think with Asian masculinity, particularly, it's a really interesting and difficult space to be in, because there's so much resentment, like racial resentment against Asian women, right? In circles of Asian men. And it's often like you don't really know that it comes up until you're like alone on a couch sitting next to another Asian man, and it just suddenly streams out. And like on Facebook, and the algorithms will constantly match me with these like groups, and then sometimes I'll join them just to be like, what are they talking? And it's very much like just shaming and this like resentment, but I feel like Asian American, Asian Canadian studies has really tried to piece apart a lot of that. Richard Fung's Looking for My Penis, for example, is just a really classic essay thinking about that. Hong Tan Nguyen's book, View from the Bottom, gives us a kind of a way of reflecting on our own subject positions as Asian men, of being always already queer, always already feminized, and what that really means in how we like move through the world, right? And not necessarily seeing it as like an awful thing, right? That this is a form of racialization, one that also really is meant to act as a binary, not only towards whiteness, but towards like Black masculinity, Latinx masculinity, and so yeah, there's certain particular reasons why it's an Asian American, Asian Canadian type of masculinity. But it was also something I was thinking about with poetry, that poetry really, if poetry is about telling the truth, it's always political, right? And what poetry does for me, it allows us to really understand the language and play with the language. And I got a lot of inspiration from docu-poetics, from like Somej Sharif, and Mai Dervong, for example, and Yellow Rain, that's her newest book. But the way that a lot of docu-poetics works by taking languages that have been very violent and obscuring and just kind of having them out there, right? And showing us what they do, and then queering them or disidentifying with them. And so throughout the book, in the section I read earlier, I use all caps, whenever I mention these like incel-y kind of terms, as a way to play around with them and to offer them as things that we can reuse, but also like a part of the conversation, right? That needs to be part of how we envision ourselves. I wanted to try and take not just make a kind of empowerment narratives about either myself or my family. I wanted to try and take all of it in that was problematic, that we would see or name as problematic, as imperial. And Somej Sharif does if you haven't read Customs or her new book, Look, I think they're some of the best ways of thinking about like military language, the language of bombing and imperial violence, and really trying to reframe that and showing us how dehumanizing they are and the kind of the ways that they pressure us differently. Yeah, but I don't know, Mila, how did you how did you receive those sections about Asian masculinity as an Asian, as a Chinese American woman?
Yeah, I mean, I'm just always fascinated when men are talking about themselves. And I think that you kind of throughout the book are bearing witness to white masculinity that's afraid of becoming irrelevant. But what I love about it is that you were very honest about your own, that your own understandings of white, like your whiteness and your, the ways in which you could be seduced along these violent pathways, right? And so, but I think what I connect to with what you just said and in my work as well is that neither of us want to reject the fetish entirely. I mean, it's so integral to our psychic lives, and we want instead to kind of inhabit or rewrite the space of fantasy. So that was one of my questions too for you, and I think this relates to what you said about poetics, and thank you for bringing up Gaza as well. It is like what in our current state of crisis, when we're really, language is failing us, institutions are lying to us, etc. And as you gestured or talked about already, you talk about when you talk about reconciliation with your father and reparations, I think that really hit me. Like I almost broke down crying when I read the part where you hug your dad after you find out about his suicide attempt. And because it's so easy, as you say, like we're we're taught to teach kids to hate their parents and hate society and capitalism and all of this. But what's really hard is forgiving one's parents in spite of all of this trauma that they inflict on us. Sorry, I'm taking this in a weird, I'm digressing here, but I just I think there's some connection here with the ways in which you embrace the kind of ambivalence of fetish of and you're not lapsing into a good bad, you know, binaristic kind of disavowal of things, but that you are willing to step into, admit, be honest, and then talk about the possibility of reconciliation through storytelling and through language. So yeah, I'm not sure if that relates to a question, but I think it does relate to the kind of politics of poetics or the possibility of poetry.
Mm. Yeah, I think so. I think like there was just, I found it in an academic language and even in a prose language, it was very hard to attend. It was very easy, I guess, in some ways to dismiss white masculinity or and my father as, to me, representing a lot of that, and religion and a lot of other things, as just nonsense, as demonic or monstrous, right? And I feel like that was a very not only hurtful to him and to people who fit the role, but to myself, because they're having that kind of binary thinking. Though I think I might have needed it at the time, in order to get away from those things for a while and to like really think critically about how I was reproducing them. It also created this line in the sand, I guess, turning sand to stone, that then said, like, if I'm like that, then I'm a horrible person too, right? And that there's no reflection on redemption, on recovery, for like alcoholism, for example. And there's no sharing of stories when it comes to things like suicidal ideation, right? Which is something that I've lived with, something my father has always lived with. And to have that kind of distance and cutting off has been really, was not good for that. Because even despite all the problems, there's things that we inherit and things that we need to learn to understand how to be in the world, and people who have gone through it. And so that started to really dawn on me once I became a father myself, and how complex all that was and how easy it had been to simplify it, to contain it is the word that I used in the reading, to see him as containable, to see myself or anyone as containable in that way. And so poetry allowed me to really to kind of just push at all of that containers and burst it open, I guess, and proliferate all those ideas. And when it comes to like self-hurt, to suicidal ideation, there's so much of my family has been also embedded in that. My brother's he's a manager who of the like suicide hotlines in Florida. And so almost all of the people who call in and who he has to assess are like queer, trans youth, right? And so, and then I have had a cousin, indigenous cousin, who successfully did that in a couple of years ago. My father has always kind of lived with and out of it. And so I wanted to also think about those issues away from what I mentioned before as a kind of regime of care or politics of care, where it's meant to be kind of institutionalized and zooms towards particular avenues, which is, I think, which works really well for some people, but for me, it never helped. Like having, reading literature about it always helped more, listening to music, and a lot of punk music is about self-harm. And a lot of it's also just about like hating themselves and making it funny, right? And playing with it. And so I always was drawn to that as a way that I felt less alone in the world. And when I was writing Nimrods too, and once I realized it was so impactful and really connecting with people, especially with students, I started to think, like, when I was a teenager, when I was, you know, in my early 20s, what could someone have given me that would have given me strength, would have given me some purpose, and would have made me feel less alone in the world. And to me, that is what I try to shape Nimrods as, like that thing that can speak to people who were like me, I guess, in that state. And I don't know if that's a huge audience, if that's a niche audience, what that really means. And to also show how that this is like, I was also not alone. I was just cutting myself from anybody who could have helped, who could have, offered some kind of experience. And I think that is also a concern I constantly have about the way we talk about self-harm, is that we're not supposed to talk about it, right? It's we're not supposed to read about it or show videos about it at all. And I get that, like it can be triggering and all that. At the same time, that obscuring and that silence statistically hasn't really helped. Like there's stats now that show that things haven't really changed despite all that. And so I'm trying to think through like, well, what if we were sharing this more and just more honest about it? And what if this became like a language that we were able to play with, to make humorous. And I feel that there's a bit more movement now in like suicidology, suicide studies, that's pushing now in that direction. There's a great book called Joy to the Worm that just came out, which is about self-harm in Shakespeare and how funny it mostly is, how it's usually taken very humorously, and how that has been completely like erased from a lot of Shakespeare studies because of the desire to read him only to read that act in a very serious way. And so I think that answers the question. I'm hoping it does.
Yeah, I mean, I think you touched, maybe I'm putting words in your mouth, but I mean, by forgiving your father in some way, in some partial, incomplete way, you forgive yourself. And this is back to the space of fantasy. I sort of see that as the greatest act of love, is that you imagine your father, like you imagine his desires, his fears, you imagine inhabiting him in this book. And I frankly was like, oh my God, I don't know if I could do that with my own parents, with whom I have lots of complex issues about, as everyone does. But in a way, this is a tremendous act of love, this act of imagining being your father. And at the same time, to go back to the question of fantasy, so I just watched 2 films about writing, American Fiction and Anatomy of a Fall, and they're both about writers who are afraid of becoming irrelevant, men who are afraid of becoming irrelevant, but also the films caution against literality, like taking things too literally. And this just gets me thinking about fantasy because I'm always thinking about it. I'm wondering if you could talk about the role of imagining and fantasy, both in terms of your writing, but also, again, like fantasy and reparations, fantasy and reconciliation, to imagine someone who's caused you so much pain, to step into their interiority, or to try to, right, is such a beautiful act of love. But say something about that.
Yeah, I think at that section, so this is section 2, and it's made to mimic a Bible. And so the way that the words come on, it's like the story of my father, but he's only called the Father. And so there's always this kind of patriarchal, like godlike form to it. It's constantly taken from the Bible. There are also like haikus, or it's a haibun kind of narrative where there's haikus that interrupt and are in the margins in this case. And then there's my own voice, which is in the notations, the footnotes, just kind of commenting a bit on what's happening. And sometimes getting into arguments with the main narrative. And but I felt like that choice was necessary in a sense to try and parse through those, like the roughest moments. And those are still the moments that like members of my family have a hard time reading, because it is the most kind of traumatic memories that my family has. And that I have as well. And so it's I had to use that kind of Bible haibun haiku form as a way to get through it, and to make it funny. And there was a lot of influences that go into it. For example, there's this video game called Disco Elysium, which is like now hailed as like the best written video game ever made. So if you are interested in writing and games, I would suggest that. But it's also about a person who's just drunk all the time and who starts talking to everything. Like, so you play this drunk detective who can talk to like lampposts, who can talk to cups, and have arguments with them, like ideological arguments about Marx with a cup. And I just started to remember, I was like, that's actually kind of what I feel like sometimes when I'm inebriated, I guess. And it was also something I remember my father doing. He would just like talk to random objects. And I was like, I haven't really seen that, in literature and poetry all that much. And it really brought out like all of this conversation and all of this self-reflection. So my father, as I'm inhabiting him and thinking about him, he's able to self-reflect by talking to all of these items. And the more inebriated, the more drunk he gets, the more that happens. And I thought that was like both really funny and just very self-reflective and very interesting. And so I found, it took me a while to find a form to reflect the things I wanted to do. And that was actually written last, like the second section, because I wrestled so much with like how to represent that without just making it a victim story, without making it a monster story either, right? Trying to get really at the gray area of understanding. Yeah, and so that was the most challenging, I think, part of writing Nimrods, even though it's probably the least vulnerable, because it's more about him than me. It was just the most like formally challenging. I had to really pull from a lot of things, including Jesmyn Ward. And so I mentioned Jesmyn Ward's work throughout the second section because I feel so indebted to her, who's writing with like Toni Morrison and Faulkner in the sense of writing about very everyday people, but with very epic, grand kind of metaphors. And so I try to use that to think about like, the Holy Trinity, God, Jesus, and the Holy Ghost and all that in the way that I talk about my own family. And the ways that like my father was in a position that I don't envy at all. Like he was the youngest child, being from a white pastor's family, evangelical Christian, being like, he just had everything forced upon him: white masculinity, religion, being the kind of, holy lamb child that was supposed to play this particular role. And he resisted in his own way. Like he's the only person on that side of the family who I know of who's married a non-white person, right? And my mother had a Black indigenous daughter when they got married, right? And so my father actually was very resistant in his own way, in a way that I could never recognize until I started to write that, right? And the things that he had to wrestle with, and that's why I tried to read that section today too. Like I don't think I would have survived were I given the things that he were given, and put in that position. And I don't know if, what survival means in that context. Like, did I? I don't know. But it's I think trying to understand all of the forces, imperial, colonial, patriarchal, religious, that make us who we are, allows us to share things and allows us to understand each other. I don't know about forgiveness, but it allows us to come to some kind of understanding.
Yeah. Has your father read the book? Is he aware of the book? Has he read it?
He's read parts of it without knowing what it was, and every time I see him, I'm convinced myself, okay, we're gonna have this conversation now. And I've told him that I was writing a book of poetry that was published about growing up and all this, and I'm kind of gauging whether he's ready to hear about it. And every time so far, it's been something very dismissive, to say in the kindest way, and in his own dismissal, I try to read as not being quite there yet. And so I try to take that as a hint about what, and I think there's a lot of even academics, like how do we give our work to our family, right? Especially when just the work that it's on, if it's on like queerness and things like that, says so much about us. And are they really ready for it? Do they want to receive it? So I think about that a lot with all my work, and not just with Nimrods, but at the same time, it's very easily Googleable. Googleable, I guess that's a word. It's very easy to find. And so it's always there. Like all my work is always there for anyone who wants to read it and think about it, including those members of my family. And yeah, I'm just kind of trying to be patient too. And I did write it though, parts of it, thinking that he was not going to be living very long because of all of the suicidal attempts and things that were happening. And so him as an audience wasn't really there. It was written more for my my mother and my sister and my twin brother and my nephew, who had to move on and flee and survive. And they have read it and seem to really like it. So
Thanks, Chris. I wonder if now is a good time to turn. I mean, I'm sure we can keep talking forever, but I'm taking a look at the time. Could we hear another passage and then open it up, do you think?
yeah, so I wanted to there's another section I can read before we go to Q&A. So I like to do that so folks can think about what they want to ask. But I wanted to read this section also because I haven't read it before and I'm curious how it will land. Let's see if I can share my screen again. It might start me from the very beginning of that, so I might have to skip through everything. Okay, yeah, that's what happened. Okay. There it is. So this is from the third section of the book called Epode, or three-chord digression. And so it plays around with the triptych kind of form, which to me is a form about movement. And I have an essay somewhere out there, an article on crafting and how I see craft as a form of movement rather than crafting like a shoe or something like that, but craft as a ship. And so I try to get to that a bit more here with this three-chord digression section. Track 3, me more ire. The revolution starts here and now within each one of us. Burn down the walls that say you can't. Be a dork, tell your friends you love them. Resist the temptation to view those around you as objects and use them. Recognize empathy and vulnerability as positive forms of strength. Resist the internalization of capitalism, the reducing of people and oneself to commodities meant to be consumed. Resist psychic death. Don't allow the world to make you into a bitter, abusive asshole. Cry in public. Don't judge other people. Learn to love yourself. Acknowledge emotional violence as real. Figure out how the idea of competition, winning and losing, fits into your intimate relationships. Decide that you'd rather be happy than be right all the time. Believe people when they tell you they are hurting or in pain. Trust. I ride, I write, I write. In my head, but not alone. Writing is fighting, said Ishmael Reed, or was it Frank Chen? What if language did not need an expert's protection? Somaz Sharif says, the poet is a caretaker of language. Poets, mother language, care, listen, handle, let language grow, touch, connect, mourn. Hippocratic oath for writers. First, be not a hypocrite. Against the father's empowerment empire, let it matter what we call humans, bodies, selves, you, I, and us. Moving to Vancouver was my second biggest lesson in patience after fathering a child. Skies dampen spirit, sensation, intellect. Evil is in the trivial, and we are devils of boredom. Gray drops slip past your knuckles. Cringe racism, watered down racism, Lulu racism. Tears never fall from my eyes. False creek fluids slither through false city. Bottom shelf racism, under the table racism, overprescribed racism. But in the rain, I drop into grief. That feeling when you're taking out the recycling, thinking, man, what another day of crazy party drinking. Just look at all these liquor bottles, then realizing you haven't had a party in months because it's COVID, and the only partier in the house during that time has been you. Cherry blossoms, treat, read, queer, exotic, Asia. All flowers made to bloom. Open color in full sunny bright, close off in deadening white, wilt and get cast into trash. This is fascism, dinner party by dinner party. And what tastes better than a buffet of color? When you think of us, think of coming once a year, reflecting sunset and causing accidents, tossing off and sporing petals all over the place. All. I'm sorry if my earlier email appeared to be casting blame. I remember our conversations about the difficulties this term and recognize that we're at max in terms of labor and speed. Chris, thank you for your apology. I did receive your email about committee work as a bit aggressive and blaming, so I appreciate your self-reflection. Under very difficult conditions of the pandemic, we are indeed all writing at max, as you said. I believe it is my job to always try to lift each other up. Hi. I want to repost the exact email I sent out below because from what I make of it, there's not a hint of aggression or blaming. As a man of color, I am very aware that anything I say or write can come off as aggressive, even when there's no intention behind it or any recognizable tonal difference. I'm sure you're familiar with how casting men of color as aggressive is part of structural racism and the ever-expanding carceral system, so I don't have to reiterate that. And asking them to self-reflect and apologize for aggression that did not occur can also feed into these systems. As you know, I respect you immensely for your research skill and commitments, and I also hesitated in saying anything because I don't want to invalidate your feelings if you did feel that I was being dismissive of the gargantuan amount of work that you've been doing, and because this is a very stressful time for everyone. But this has been an ongoing issue since I came to, and I think increased awareness would really help. I never planned to get a PhD or to become a professor of any kind. I applied to graduate school because, as the rabbit said, why not? I thought maybe with a master's I could teach in some foreign country and travel around. It took me 3 years to get an acceptance, despite having near perfect grades, despite graduating college at 19. For the years in between, I traveled, I taught, I wrote stories and poems. I rewrote my application essay about James Joyce. In 2007, I was accepted to the University of Washington's English program, but was offered no scholarships or funding. I went into massive debt. My supervisor told me I was only accepted because of my persistence, not my work. Acceptance without means is no acceptance. He said I never should have gotten into grad school, so I routed myself through different routes. You're writing abysmal, you're thinking inferior. Why won't you go away? I never planned to get a PhD or to become a professor of any kind. But when it comes to vengeance, I am persistent. It's a long time coming, what with our donors, patrons, nations, so we have to help assimilate her, domesticate her, acculturate her, socialize her to our department without taking away her fire, light, life. You know, how do we harness into flame, into flesh, into flesh? Is this how they talked about me? The M dash, my emotion, the redaction, my red action. The strike through strikes the match, and the grays flash rays of fire, light, life. My university orbits the Death Star on its least affordable moon in Endor, colonized Cambodian-like forests whose peoples turn stuffed toys on shelves. Oil-rich trigger the blue blood rich, camouflaged in $300 sandals. Wealth appears, poor, educated share warnings of the regressive dumb. Some are granted cultural capital but can't pay the rent and must light fires to keep warm. Tell them to write your life, not if your life offends us. Nation of good cops to America's bad cops, the factual cop who gets shocked when the other cop beats you in your face, too shocked to pick up a phone or a fist. So if all cops are bastards, then we cannot attack the Death Star until the land of Endor first incites in our luminescence. In Cambodia, trigger warnings warn us of actual landmines. Me, pushed to write about myself. This is it, the BIPOC biopic. More, an autobiography gestures to the world of a reading self. Ire, seas of words, crafts we build to carry us from shelf to shelf. Title, tattle, tirade. I can't think about those times. My mother texts to the family chat. Are you a memoirist? Yeah, it's really hard to remember anything or think about it. Or just a pervert. Yeah, so let's not. Writer's dilemma. Stretch the truth or turn the knife. Interior, infernal, inferior. Ground swells under writer. I draw lines in the sand with found sticks. Please don't mix up sand for stone. I know nothing of craft. I know only the industrial sewer, how to read its maps, how to direct its channels of waste, from wreckage to reservoir. Toxic, yet full of color. A scavenger for salvage. I am drawn to the sense of the piled up patch. Academy, refuse, home. Dear counselors and therapeutics, in answer to your question, are you still having suicidal thoughts? No. Why? Of course not. Not really, but I've been tugging on its roots. Not really, but I'm still thinking of ways to provoke some hero's gun. Not really, but if I was crossing the street and a car came barreling toward me, I'm not sure I'd get out of the way. Not really, but if I lost everything and turned into my father, I'd still feel the same. Not really. But is it high-risk behavior to testify to one's own faithless yearnings for the pleasure of pleasing, the desire to be desired, and trust a jury of readers not to convict? Not really, but I still tend to keep myself on the hook. For example, this book. Not really, but I still fight like I am. Not really, but I still write like I am. Thank you. Hopefully there are questions. How do I stop this? Okay.
If not, I'm sure I have tons more questions. Is there a question in Q&A? Oh, yes, there's 3. Chris, do you want to go through them and see which ones you want to answer, or should we read them out loud?
I don't see them for some reason, but maybe you can read them then, and I'll just react.
It's in the Q&A open. I'll just read them in the order that they came in. So this is from V. Pawahi. I appreciate and love your use of the term hale, which in Olilo, Hawaii, we know the term historically to mean foreigner. That stems back from the time of so-called discovery through European voyage. The late and great Dr. Hunani K. Trask once had a student who tried to weaponize the term haole, as he was a white student who didn't like the term. Being that you have family ties, proximity, and experience in Hawaii, how do you unpack the term haole as it comes to you in an assumed masculine context from a multicultural brown community when Kanaka Maoli or Native Hawaiians are policed for using the term?
Yeah, no, I've had so many friends and not, I guess in my white families particularly, who just really regard haole as like a very close to like the N-word or something. Like that's what they say, right? That it's like completely and I feel like that fragility again around those kind of things is really difficult and also needs to be kind of dealt with and exposed a bit. And like when I was growing up, my family, my mother would always refer to me as Hapa Haole, meaning I was half white. And the other members of my family too we were all kind of Hapa in different ways. I guess we're like half or mixed. And so everybody in my family got a Hapa something almost. All of me and my cousins, I guess. And I should say that my family in Hawaii is very mixed with different racial groups, I guess. And though I think most of us see ourselves as coming from like Ilocos Norte in the Philippines and being, plantation workers. At the same time, my mother is the only person on that side of the family who has had half white children. And so growing up in that context and being like the lightest skinned of my family, and then being called Hapa Haole, I always saw it more as a term of endearment. I almost saw it as a kindness, and there's this line in Nimrods too, that's about building bridges, right? And that these words, if we just stop with the fragility around them, sometimes they are bridges. Like this is how we can respectfully kind of meet on the same grounds. And it's an offering to me in that sense of like, here's how we can relate. And the immediate rejection of it, whether by being offended or whatever, by white people being offended by it, to me is a rejection of that bridge. It's actually a rejection of reconciliation. And so that's one reason I try to use it throughout the book. And also because it's how, my family still talks about that side of my family as the Haole side. So I didn't want to, I feel adjusting the book for the white side of my family or any people who had more power and continue to have more power was just the opposite direction. I would always just go the opposite direction with that. And so like, for example, like I feel like I ran a student workshop yesterday on book, and the question of like, who is this book accountable for? And would always come with, what does my father think about it? Or what does my like white grandfather, my white family think of it? As opposed to what does the other side of my family think about it, right? And so I just wanted to like highlight that accountability is always kind of that we make assumptions about it. And for me, it was the book to me is very accountable to certain parts of my family, and not others. And so I try to never have that side of like who on my white side of my family might be offended by what I'm saying. I try to center the other side of my family, and Holly was one way I think just connect to relate to that. Yeah, but thank you, Palahi. That's a great question.
Thanks, Chris. The next question comes from Manmit. Very beautiful talk and still processing so many ideas. Thank you so much. I was wondering about the name Nimrods. How did you arrive at that name?
Yeah, it's it's the title of a 1997 fake punk band's album called Nimrod. And so I'm playing around with that album throughout the book, and with punk in general, and what I call like fake punk throughout. And the reason I call it fake punk is because there's such a policing around punk. And I just went to the punk rock museum in Las Vegas during the break, and you could just really see it in full force. It completely excludes a lot of the Riot Grrrl movement. Slater Kinney, I don't know if anyone knows who these bands are, but a lot of the bands that are like very, very important to punk are just not even mentioned. And there's this kind of punk rock police is what people often call it, where like bands like Green Day and Blink-182 and all that are just complete like sellouts. So this whole narrative of selling out, and I think it helped me understand myself as someone who like tries to resist being a sellout constantly, and what that could mean, and like growing up in that culture of like if you appeal to more than 100 people, you're already a horrible person, you know. So it's a really strange subculture to kind of adhere to. And so Nimrod, I was trying to like take as a kind of way to begin that conversation. And a lot of the book could be read as an ekphrasis, a musical ekphrasis of punk rock, and particularly that album, because that album is also about a bisexual man who's really wrestling with fatherhood, and whose father passed away when he was like 8 or 9 or something, and so having no model for fatherhood. Though of course nobody reads the lyrics that way, but that's to me what they're about. And so the Nimrod is also a word that my father once claimed to invent, like as an insult. He told me he was the first person ever to use that word as an insult. And of course, like I don't think he would ever even remember he said that, because he might have been inebriated at the time. But it's just one of those kind of funny things that like is just a bit ridiculous that I wanted to keep in there. And Nimrod is also a biblical figure. It's the first patriarch, the first king on earth that God kind of sends to earth. So if God isn't the first patriarch, Nimrod is. And before Nimrod was used as an insult, it was used to like mean like a hypermasculine kind of body type. And then I wanted to pluralize, this is probably getting TMI at this point, but I wanted to pluralize Nimrods, because I'm not just talking about my father or about, you know, a single person. I'm talking about myself too, and I'm trying to include everybody who might be wrestling with these thoughts and ideas as Nimrods. And yeah, I wanted to bring all that complexity there. So, but thank you, Manmeet.
Olivia Nim asks, the book description for Nimrods points to the, quote, crass, cringy, and raw style of the text. How is the book thinking through and perhaps reframing these feelings that are often considered unpleasant or things to be avoided? What is the potential of turning to the idea of cringe in the context of the anti-memoir?
Yeah, I'm teaching actually this ContraPoints Natalie Wynn video on cringe, which I think is a really almost like Susan Sontag-ish kind of breakdown of cringe and cringe culture. So I invite folks to read that, or to watch that on YouTube. And the whole politics around cringe is really fascinating, and the kind of queering of cringe, because it kind of goes back to camp, like queer camp, and the kind of shock value of it, but also the way that cringe allows us to speak about very difficult issues, because a cringe is a kind of embarrassment. Like we feel embarrassed for whoever's speaking, but then we feel embarrassed for ourselves for sharing in those thoughts. And so to me, it's a way of like lightly touching on issues that you might want to keep wrapped up. And for me, being a cringy poet too is a way of also like just accepting my own nervousness around poetry. When I was writing Nimrods, I would write like 5 or 10 times in a notebook. Can't write for shit these days. I write that like 5 or 10 times, can't write. I'm a horrible writer. This is gonna suck, whatever comes out, you know, it's gonna be terrible. Let's see what happens over the next half hour or whatever. And then that would free me to be able to express myself by just saying like, I'm a cringy, crappy poet. And let's have fun with that, you know? And so I think presenting the work, to me, like framing it around that is important because it also lets the reader in. Like you don't have to find these words beautiful, you know. Yes, there's probably all these layers going on in each of these like page poems, but you also don't have to know that. Like you don't have to know poetic terms. You know, I try to make all the poetry work on different levels so that you could just do a very surface level reading of it and come away with something. If you want to know more about like the influences that are going into it, if you want, you know, the way that I try to like think about the space in the poem and the image kind of poetry of it, then that's also useful. But I wanted it immediately to relate to anybody, to students especially. And so saying like, this is cringy, it's going to be fun, it's going to be weird, I think was one of those connective, like relational decisions to the audience.
I love that. The last question by Heidi Reinhardt is, at what stage in writing did you decide to publish with an academic press versus a trade press? And how much do you feel it mattered to your book? Would this be a question of genre or something else? Thank you.
Yeah, I wish I had more choice in the matter, I guess, or the authors in general had more choice. I didn't really have a lot of a choice. I sent it to a lot of trade presses. And it was very warmly welcomed, but also like, we don't know what we would do with it, how we would sell it kind of thing. And which I understood, like part of me was like, this isn't like, who would ever publish this? Like who would be that, you know, weird to publish something like this or that, yeah, who would invite it? And so I wasn't expecting a lot. I was just like, you know, I feel like it's at a certain point, let's see what happens if I send it out. And part of it was published in the Journal of Asian American Studies with Erin Quaynon and Shireen Rashanovan. They did an amazing special issue on the Me Too movement and called the #WeToo. And so part of it was published there, and I thought that's as far as it would go. But it was kind of like a why not moment, you know. It's like I take rejection very well as an author because I'm also like self-hating a bit. So like if an editor is like, this is sucks, I'm like, yeah, you're right, it does. Like, I know that, you know. And so I can take rejection really well. So I'll just send things out and see if anyone likes it. And if not, it's another chance to revise it, I guess. So I went through a long process. And when it was sent to Duke, I wasn't at all expecting that they would like it, or that they would even respond. And it turned out they really loved it. And I did find that women of color, especially an Asian woman, really like academics, really liked what I was doing and were really heralding the text and really wanted it to come out. And I think part of it was a teaching thing. Like often in Asian American literature, like there's this desire to treat memoirs written by Asian men, mixed race Asian men, and there just aren't many out there, especially out there that aren't like really trying to think through this positionality. And so there was this hunger for it that I didn't even realize was going to come into play when I was trying to publish the work, but it really did. And so like Erin Quaynon, Jan Patios, Tara Fickle, there's a lot of women in Asian American studies, Asian Canadian studies that helped a lot with trying to get the book out there, with helping to offer feedback for it. Daniel Wong and Christine Kim here went through writing workshops for it. And so it was partly like, oh, people like this. And people like it also who I wouldn't really expect to like it. So I'm really grateful and very lucky to have those networks, and you, Mila, as friends.
Thanks, Chris. Yeah, I would just say I'm teaching your book. Some of my grads are here, and I asked Chris to think of a film to pair with it, and you suggested Chan is Missing, and something you said a couple minutes ago actually made me think of it, because in one scene, though, there's like a woman kind of law enforcement person. She says the difference between English speakers and Chinese cultural speakers is English speakers are focused on grammar and being like grammatically correct, and the Chinese speakers are focused on the relationship between between the speakers, or between the listener and the speaker. So when you talked about thinking about the relationship between with you and the reader, it's just like, oh, and Chan is Missing is kind of a very punk, like indie Asian American film, right? Really important film. So we have another question from Jenny Lee. This book is a great balance of incisive and approachable. You are not a cringy, crappy poet. For those of us who are interested in Nimrod's contribution to Filipino diasporic poetry, are there other Phil Can or Phil Am poets you'd recommend?
Yeah, thank you so much, Jenny Lee, for that. Jenny Lee is also an amazing author and has a new short story collection out about domestic workers in Canada. I think it's the first story collection. I might be right about that. And it's so good. It's so fantastic. So check her work out. Yeah, like one person that really brought me into, I don't know if I would consider Filipino diasporic, besides like Carlos Bulosan, is R. Zamora Lindmark, Zach Lindmark, who wrote the book Rolling the R's, which is kind of like Nimrods and a lot of my work where but even more so, I guess. Lindmark grew up in Hawaii and wrote this as his like MFA thesis or a master's thesis or something, and did not ever expect anyone to ever read it or to get published. But it's about multiple youthful characters who are in Hawaii and just have a very, it's very, very humorous and very raw, cringy, I would say too, but it's and very real. And I think that non-expectation about publishing and not thinking at all about that for, while writing it is really apparent in that work. So I'd really suggest that. There's a lot of great Filipino-Canadian, Filipinx-Canadian authors. I was just in an anthology with many of them, if not like with a lot of them. Magdaragat, which we had a couple book launches for, and is now in a second edition because there were some textual problems and some miscommunications, I guess, with some of the writers. But yeah, it's a great place to, and I found so much acceptance there with the authors there, and I'm really grateful to be part of that community. And my piece in that anthology is about like all the anxieties about community. And so I was wondering like, how would they receive this, being like, mixed race American. And they were very, very welcoming to it. And I like that there's spaces out there that we can all kind of identify with and, within our different mixtures and boundaries. And I don't know how new that is. It's a place that I didn't feel that welcome into when I was starting out. And I don't know how much of that was me, was me feeling like I didn't belong, not knowing the language and things like that, and how much of it was them. And for me, I think a lot of the reflection that I've been doing is that a lot of it was me. And like you were saying, Mila, like the ways that whiteness kind of inserts itself, right? That if I don't immediately feel accepted in this community because there's different languages and all this difference, then they're excluding me, right? And that's something that I think we have to really reflect on, that maybe we're feeling excluded because there's difference, and that's a valid feeling. It's not necessarily a logically like connected one. Yeah, not necessarily one that's within the community itself and appreciates the differences of community.
Yeah, absolutely. What another question from Aliyah Ali. I'm super curious to know how Kai responded to your book, or how he may respond to your book as he gets older, or how you hope he responds to your book.
He's sitting behind me. But he's distracted with something. That's an interesting. He's doing a race, a Frit Lord race. I don't know. Alphabet Lord race. I don't want to ask him exactly what he thinks right quite yet. That's a really good question. I feel I hope that he receives it well and likes it and thinks it's funny. because a lot of it was written for him in mind, you know, and there's passages in that too that are like, here's advice I can give you, and here's the advice I can't give you, right? Here's the advice I don't trust myself on giving you. And I think trying to be honest about that like, I don't know everything you need to know to operate in this world, and a lot of the things I think I know might be really things that you disagree with, and things that might not be that helpful, but here's what I can offer. And I think because he's also, you know, he's part Cambodian, Filipino, what else is he, Chinese, white, that there's a lot of things that I feel like he could wrestle with in the same way as I did, but in a completely different context. So I don't want to presume that I know everything about it. And so I hope that the work, not just influencing him, but influencing like others, can be taken that way. Like, that's why I feel like it's a cringy line that I don't want the audience to take sand for stone. Every time I read it, I'm like, I could have come up with a better metaphor, but actually I couldn't. That's the sad story of it. But I hope that that audiences see it that way, that there is this kind of playfulness, and that every poem is responding to the one before it in a way, so that it's never quite finished, right? That it's not really meant to be like a line that you can take and put at the bottom of your email, you know, that Kawika Chris said this once, and like, no, none of the lines work like that. They're not quotable in that way. They're all kind of like cringy and unfinished thoughts. And I'm hoping that that allows a different kind of reading practice, one that's invitational to the reader to continue those ideas, to respond to them in their own way. And I hope that Kai was able to think that about it too.
Thanks, Chris.
Thank you.
Oh, I think we're out of time. That's the last question. I will hand it back over to Mary, but I just wanted to thank you again for allowing me to be in conversation, and thank you for this beautiful talk and reading.
Thank you.
And I'm sure that I'm speaking for everyone in conveying my thanks, Chris and Mila. I'm just so glad that Nimrods was published. I'm so glad that as soon as I saw it, I was already imagining this session, and it's so rare that a session is just so much better than anything I ever imagined. What a wonderful dialogue. I know when I was reading Nimrods, I couldn't read the last chapter because I just didn't want it to be over. And I feel the same way today. So thank you, Chris and Mila, for a wonderful, beautiful dialogue. I invite all of our audience to join us again, February the 7th, for a Black Studies in Canada dialogue between Ronaldo Walcott and Peter Hudson. Thank you to the audience for your wonderful questions, and everyone for pivoting to Zoom. I'm so glad that we could do this today. So thank you, everyone. See you next time.
Thank you. I wish I could stay after and chat with everyone. But feel free to email me or contact me. Thank you again.
Thank you. Thank you.